Okay, well, I apologize for folks who made it all the way to class only to hear from Doug, our security guard, that I had to cancel. As I said in the email, I'm home right now on bed rest. Hopefully we'll be back tomorrow or next week, but if I am, I will certainly be sitting down. But in the meantime, what we'll be doing is a combination of some video viewing, and I'm also going to have you guys contribute to some small discussion boards. The focus for this video is development, but particularly infant and child development. Next week we'll focus on adolescent and adult. I'll go ahead and post a series of objectives for this module, which would be this week and next week. The objectives for today that we'll be focusing on is I want to talk a little bit about infantile amnesia, which is the fact that we really can't remember anything that happens from probably before 4 years of age. If you think about your earliest memory, it's probably right around the end of your 3rd year to the beginning of your 4th year. Then we'll get away from that point with regards to infancy and start talking about child development. And you really can't talk about child development unless you talk about Jean Piaget. And Piaget noted that kids weren't just small adults, that they thought differently. They made different kinds of mistakes than adults do, and the way they approach problems seems to change as they get older. And this is where a lot of the videos that I have assigned fit in, because there's really some adorable videos of kids making the sorts of mistakes that Piaget picked up on. Now, not only does our cognitive ability develop over the years, but that also helps to support changes in our moral development. And so we'll talk a little bit about what Kohlberg had discussed with regards to our phases of moral development. And then we'll move a little bit away from cognition and get into more social development. We'll talk about some of the landmark experiments of Harry Harlow. There's 2 videos that I want you to watch for him. And then also Ainsworth and the research that she did on attachment, and how attachment early in life to our caregivers predicts the kind of attachment that we'll have as adults. Before we get into cognitive and social development, though, I do want to speak just really briefly on physical development. And this largely revisits some of the stuff that we talked about in the very second week of class, and the fact that in order for our brains to develop normally in infancy, we really need stimulation. So that's visual stimulation, touch, all kinds of sensory stimulation. We need to hear language around us. We need to be hugged. We need a number of sources of stimulation, because if we don't have that, what ends up happening is our neurons die off. Now, a certain amount of neural death, or as I have here, neural pruning, is normal and is preferred. So when we are first born, as I said in the second week of class, we have a huge number of neurons, and they have kind of limited or weak connections to other neurons down here in the yellow. And over time, some of these neurons represented here in red, those connections get stronger, whereas other neurons represented here in green, those connections will get weaker and weaker until eventually they die off. As I said in week 2, we need to have really strong connections. I gave the example of writing your name in glue and putting on the glitter, shaking off the glitter. Only the stuff that has a really strong connection remains. That's how it's supposed to be. But in order to help those strong connections, we need to have lots of stimulation. And down here, I don't think I showed these pictures in week 2. This is a child's brain. This is a PET scan that shows general levels of activity. And this is a child that developed normally. This one over here is a child who spent the first several years of its life in an orphanage, a Romanian orphanage, where there was very little sensory stimulation, very little movement that was allowed. Basically, the child just sat in a crib in an institution with really just its diapers being changed a little bit and being fed. And hopefully what you can see is there's a lot more activity in the normal brain than in the deprived brain, because excessive neural pruning has happened. All right, I'm shifting gears now. Hopefully you have had enough sensory stimulation, you've been able to move, you've been able to explore, and that will support normal cognitive and social development. So that's really going to be what the bulk of this video addresses. Now, when we are in infancy, our brains are still very much under development. And because our brains aren't fully developed, we experience something that's known as infantile amnesia. As I said before in the objectives, if you think back to your earliest memory, I know for me it's a memory of I had a flower that basically all the petals fell out, and I was convinced, because of course I thought my dad could do everything, I was convinced that he would be able to fix it. And I guess this was my first big disappointment in my dad, and I was right around the age of 4, so it was a highly emotional memory. I talked before about the importance of emotion. It's certainly something that the full story is very cute, so it's been repeated many times. But it happened when I was kind of between the ages of 3 and 4, like right at that shifting point. So that's my earliest memory, and I would imagine that if you really think back, your earliest memory is probably not going to be too much before age 4. So that is infantile amnesia. Now the thing that we've wondered about is what causes it. Well, one possibility is we know that in order for memories to be formed, we need our hippocampus. Talked before about the role of hippocampus in memory consolidation. Well, guess when the hippocampus is fully mature? About 4 years of age. And so if the structure that's necessary to form memory isn't mature until 4, of course you're not going to have any conscious memories. You can still learn how to walk, you can learn how to talk, but conscious memories of experiences, which is what hippocampus really does well, aren't going to be intact. Another possible explanation is a lack of language, really sophisticated language. If you think about what a memory involves, a lot of our memories require that we tell ourselves a certain story. In order for the memory to make sense, we have to have that language in order to tell that story. And up until about the ages of 3 and 4, our language is not sufficiently sophisticated to tell that story. So we need a mature language in order to have a conscious memory. A third possibility for why it takes so long for us to be able to form these conscious memories of our experience is that those conscious memories really represent a part of our identity, a part of ourselves that is distinct. It's different from other people. And as we will address when we get to the Jean Piaget stuff, we don't have a good, solid sense of ourselves, of who we are as being distinct from other people, until about the age of 4. And in fact, what we see is when we look at other cultures, other collectivist cultures, where a sense of self isn't quite as strong as it is in an individualistic culture like America, we see that infantile amnesia actually lasts longer. So Chinese people, often their earliest memory is around the age of 5. So their brains are still developing the same, their language is developing the same. What's different is that sense of self. And so it's been argued that maybe we don't have good memories until we actually have a good sense of ourselves. All right, so now we're going to get to the issue of cognitive development and Jean Piaget. You can't talk cognitive development without bringing up Piaget's stages. Now Piaget, he started his work by doing intelligence testing with young people. And what he noticed was on these IQ tests, kids were making mistakes. That wasn't a surprise. What was a surprise is that they all tended to make the same mistakes at a certain age group. And once those kids got older, they no longer made those mistakes. And so he started to think that if everybody who's 5 is making the same kind of error, that tells me that 5-year-olds are thinking in a qualitatively different way. They're approaching the world differently than maybe a 7-year-old or a 12-year-old, differently than a 3-year-old. And so Piaget really started to study the cognitive errors that kids make. And as I said before, I have a number of videos that are posted. They really won't take you very long to watch. Definitely look at these videos because they really help to bring to life these errors that Piaget was noticing. Now, one of the concepts that Piaget talked about is that of a schema. We have schemas or kind of categories or stereotypes for so many things in our life. So, for example, what is your schema for a birthday party? When I say birthday party, there's probably a collection of images and expectations that come to mind. But for example, your birthday party schema might involve cake, birthday candles, some balloons, party hats, maybe a trip to Chuck E. Cheese, or at least that's what your schema would have been when you were 7. Okay? That was the way you processed the world. That was your expectation, your schema for a party. Okay. Now, let's say your first party was like this. You had some friends over in your backyard, you played some pin the tail on the donkey, that kind of thing, and you created a schema based upon that one experience. Well, then you got invited to another friend's birthday party, and it was at Chuck E. Cheese's. Okay, well, that was going to be a different experience. You'd still have the cake, you'd still have the candles, the birthday hat, the balloons, but you got tokens and video games and the ball crawling. You got to meet Chucky and all that stuff. So you had to modify your schema. You had to take this new event of the Chuck E. Cheese experience and kind of expand your concept of birthday party. And so Piaget would say whenever you were modifying an existing schema to fit new events, that was known as assimilation. But now let's say your 7-year-old self got invited to Aunt Cheryl's birthday party. And Aunt Cheryl is maybe in her late 30s. Well, think about it. Do you think that birthday party, where's my cursor? That birthday party is going to look anything like your existing schema? No, probably not. Probably at Aunt Cheryl's birthday party, there will be nicely dressed adults, there will be fancy food, there's going to be wine, there's going to be music you haven't heard and jokes you don't understand. And so this is a completely different thing. And so Piaget argued that when the new event is so different that it doesn't really connect with your existing schema, you need to create an entirely new schema. And he called that accommodation. So assimilate or similar, that's when you have a really similar event. When you need to come up with something completely different, you have completely accommodate. That's the best I can do to try and make the connection. You have a completely different schema that you need to create. So now if you're a 7-year-old and you get told, hey, we're going to go to a party, you're going to ask, how old is this person? Because you know if it's a young person, that's your first schema. If it's an older person, that's your new schema. And so Piaget was noticing that as kids develop, one of the things that has to happen is they form all of these new schemas for the world. And really, we need these things. So if you know that you're going to go into a college class, at this point you have a schema for what's going to happen. You know what to expect. And probably being able to know what to expect reduces your anxiety level. If every time you did something new, you had no idea what to expect, you had no schema, it would be very anxiety provoking, and it would probably be really distracting because you would have to think so hard about, okay, what's going to come next? What am I supposed to do? That you wouldn't really be able to enjoy and take advantage of the situation. So it's really important that we have these schemas so we know what to expect. All right, now I'm going to move on to discussing Piaget's stages. As I said before, there are 4 stages, and definitely I encourage you to read over the book in this section and take some notes about each of the 4 stages. The first one he referred to as the sensorimotor stage. This is really infancy, early toddlerhood. At this point, children aren't speaking. Language starts to emerge in this stage, but they're really not very verbal. And so since they can't talk, the way that they explore the world is through their senses and through motor exploration. And they're going to be probably grabbing things and putting things in their mouths and touching your face because they need to explore through touch. Now, during this stage, several skills will develop. And you can see object permanence, which is the understanding that just because things, you can no longer see them, they still exist. That develops. And so there's a nice video to demonstrate this phenomenon. Another thing that is developing during this stage is the ability to recognize oneself. And so in the video I have a baby looking at itself. Early on in this stage, a baby will see a mirror and have absolutely no interest in it. Towards the end of this stage, they're able to recognize themselves and they can connect with that self-image in the mirror. Another thing that we see, and this will become evident when we do the attachment discussion, is that kids will exhibit anxiety with strangers. So if they're passed off from mom or dad to a stranger, there's going to be a lot of crying. Or if the caregiver leaves, there's going to be crying, and that is perfectly healthy. So at this point, you might want to pause this video and start looking at the other videos, or perhaps you just want to finish this one and then look at all of Piaget's videos. Right, now I've moved on to the next stage, which basically goes from toddlerhood all the way up to early childhood, first couple years of elementary school. And this is what Piaget called the pre-operational stage. And at this point, I think this is really interesting. Kids fail to understand that an object has some basic characteristics that cannot be altered, like its size or its volume, just how much it's worth, its value. They don't really understand that an object is going to remain the same no matter how they view it. And there's a couple of really great videos, and I really do encourage you to pause this and start looking at them. So in one of the videos, it demonstrates egocentrism, which is a kid's inability to take another person's perspective. This is the video that has two kids looking at a volcano diorama. Another thing is a video where a kid has not developed what Piaget called conservation, which is the ability to understand that just because something might change its shape or change its volume, you haven't altered the object itself. So there's a little girl looking at glasses of water or stacks of quarters, and I think you'll better understand this concept if you actually watch the video. Another thing that we see during this stage is that kids are developing the ability to organize and form things into categories. So when a child is young, for example, if you ask them to divide all of their stuffed animals into two categories, what you're going to see is probably they're going to move a couple stuffed animals over to one side, another couple of stuffed animals to another side, without really much rhyme or reason. However, as they get older, as they near the end of this pre-operational stage, they're going to come up with these core characteristics of the object and use those core characteristics to categorize. So an older child within this stage is going to maybe organize the stuffed animals according to value to them, according to color, according to size, some kind of core characteristic. Something else that we see is if we're asking a child to do some math, and this would be, maybe when they're about 6 years old, they've started to understand addition. If you ask a child, if we know that 5 plus 2 equals 7, what does 2 plus 5 equal? Well, even if they can't do math, if they had this understanding of reversibility, it's obvious. So if I tell you that 2 plus x equals 3, what does x plus 2 equal? Well, even though you don't know what x is, you can still answer that question. It's going to equal 3. But a kid can't do that. What you'll see is when you say, what is 2 plus 5, they're just going to have to count all over again to figure it out. They don't understand that these numbers have core characteristics or core meaning that can't be altered. Okay, and then the final thing that I wanted to discuss, actually I guess I have two things, is the fact that when people are still in this pre-operational stage, if you change an object's size, so you actually alter the core characteristics, in some cases it doesn't make sense to them. They really don't understand what to do when those core characteristics are altered. And so I think this concept is really better explained in the video. They do a better job than I am. Unfortunately, this is always something that I stumble on. So watch the video. And then the final thing that I wanted to address is this poor theory of mind. The ability to understand what's going on in another person's head. So egocentrism and poor theory of mind relate well together. And the video that I've assigned for this is a little kid looking at a bag of peanut M&Ms and being able to take another person's perspective. So definitely pause this video, and if you haven't already, take a look at the Piagetian videos that I have up on Blackboard, and then go ahead and restart it to go on to the later stages. Okay, so now, all of those things that I talked about on the last slide are developing during the preoperational stage. Once they're all intact and a kid appreciates that objects have just fundamental characteristics that are not going to change, and if they do change, then it's a new object altogether that you have to approach differently. Once they understand this concept, Piaget would say, okay, now they understand the concept of an operation, and they become much more concrete in their thinking. And so this happens basically middle childhood, so 7 to 12 years old. So during this time, because thinking is so concrete, kids are really good about following rules. In fact, if you try to break a rule, if you're trying to play a game with a kid, maybe you're missing a piece for the game, and you say, oh, well, okay, let's just play a little bit differently. Kids have a really hard time with that. Sometimes they can do it, but a lot of times they're so fixed on those immutable characteristics that they will not change the rules. On the upside, because they're really good at understanding rules, this is typically a pretty easy age for child rearing. You set the rules, they follow them. Now, when they have this concrete thinking, they are able to understand math really well because they have that reversibility that I talked about in the last slide. They have concepts of time and space, so that's a little bit of abstract thinking, but they're still really very concrete in this phase. We also see that there's a great deal of language development that's occurring at this point. So language development is really something that I'm not talking much about in this class, but be mindful that we see a really huge explosion in language ability and grammar at this stage, and certainly this is where you do a lot of learning in school of vocabulary and grammatical rules, because hopefully kids are going to be able to understand these rules at this point. Now, once a kid gets out of this really concrete thinking, then they move into what Piaget called formal operations. So you can see here, this is basically middle school and above. Now, once a person hits formal operations, they're able to be much more abstract in their thinking, dealing with things that don't have a clear-cut, concrete answer, like morality, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, religion, justice. These are things that have a lot of gray areas. Kids at this age have the ability to discuss hypotheticals. Back during concrete operations, they don't. So you can ask kids hypothetical questions here, and they're able to entertain possibilities. We also see that reasoning is developing here. So right now, when a person hits 11 years old, intellectually they have a great deal of freedom. They can do a lot of things with their brain.